I want to talk about two important historical contexts for getting the jokes in The Gentleman Dancing Master. So, and this will actually be true going forward for, I think, a lot of Restoration drama in understanding these two things. Well, it'll be different for each play, but first of all is the slave trade. One thing that's extraordinary about The Gentleman Dancing Master is that it has Black characters in it, and they're associated with the Spanish, with the fake Spanish, but he was actually a Spanish merchant and benefiting from the Spanish Empire. So where was England in the slave trade if this is a kind of parody of admiration, excessive admiration for the Spanish, or if it is simply just admiration for the Spanish? Where was the English in the slave trade? Well, the English were involved in buying and selling of slaves, using of slaves in plantations for a long time, but they only really entered the slave trade with Charles II. So there was an initial company chartered, I think very early, like in 1661 or two, that was the Company of Royal Adventurers to Africa. And that company ended up failing, but it was reborn in right around this time, 1672, 73, as the Royal African Company. And Charles and Catherine were major stockholders in this company. And the person who ran the company on a day-to-day basis, who was called the governor of the company, was James II, the Duke of York. And he would eventually become king when Charles died, and he was in line for the throne. You know, of course, he was king only briefly, partly because he was Catholic and was rebelled against, but that's another story. For now, it's important to remember how close the slave trade was to the crown. So there's a lot of arguments about the 17th century and about how you'll see tensions between elite aristocrats and upstart merchants. But really, Charles II wasn't trying to stop capitalism. He was actually trying to monopolize it. And so he, you know, this company, there's a wonderful book by John O'Brien about the history of corporations. And he argues that the Royal African Company was the model for other corporations that would emerge later in the 17th century and into the 18th century. And so, so part of the reason that Charles II was able to start his own company for trading in enslaved people was his marriage to Catherine of Braganza. As you recall, Catherine of Braganza was from Portugal. Portugal was the first European country to trade in enslaved people. And they built along the African coast what they call slave forts. And, you know, we know them now as places where enslaved people were held, and it was the point of transition between Africa and being sold to European traders. So it was really Portugal that began this process, and Spain came shortly afterwards. Charles II wanted a piece of that action. And so part of his decision to marry Catherine of Braganza, I'm persuaded, was to get access to some of those slave forts, which were actually built by the Portuguese. And then part of what they're fighting with the Dutch all the time about is for control of these slave forts. So the slave trade is really an important background to this period. You don't really hear enough about it, but it's a very important part of it. So the crown had a monopoly on trading in enslaved people until the end of the Glorious Revolution. And then in the 1690s, there was a big debate about whether it should be opened up to other people. But for now, you have to think of it as not so much as a business, like just a regular person gets an idea, hey, I'll start this company, but as a state-run enterprise and a state monopoly and a enterprise that was backed by the military. And so that is an important aspect of understanding what's going on in this period. So the Spanish are represented in the play as people who have African servants or African enslaved people. It's not really clear in the play what their status is, but I think the fact that England had very recently entered into this competition with Spain for this business is part of the background of this play, part of what you need to understand. So the other thing you need to understand is that England was at war with the Dutch, the Third Dutch War. They were at war with the Dutch very frequently in this period, although they also admired the Dutch and modeled a lot of their economy eventually, I think, on the Dutch. But at this time, they're aligned with the French. So that seems kind of funny because the French are being made fun of, but there was a great admiration for the French, and the French had a very powerful army, a powerful military force. They were formidable, and they were way ahead of England in terms of colonialism and also in slave plantations as well. And so the Dutch were competing with the English for these slave forts along the coast of Africa that Charles had gained in his marriage contract with Catherine of Braganza. In fact, her dowry was, and Charles was not happy about this at all, but her dowry was partly paid for in sugar. They just they didn't have the money for what they promised for her dowry, and they paid it off in sugar from their plantations. Of course, you know, Brazil being the major Portuguese sugar plantation, and so the Dutch and the English were essentially in the Third Dutch War were competing. In part, they were competing for all kinds of things, but it was a war over trade. And one of the trades that they were competing over was the slave trade. And so this is important because the English were late in terms of Europeans to enter the slave trade. And I know, like, mostly you think of slavery in the 18th century as an English thing and as an aspect of the British Empire. But really, at this time, it was other countries that were way ahead of England, and there was definitely some ambivalence that you can detect if you look closely in among English people about entering this business. And I believe that you see some of this, you see a lot of this ambivalence in the theater, even though the theater is under royal protection. I think a lot of the theater artists were close enough to the court that they could get away with criticism in a way that other people couldn't. And so Charles had an investment in keeping the theaters open. Marriage to Catherine of Braganza was very important. It gave England access to these slave forts, which also meant that England had kind of a chance to build an empire. Catherine had been living in Portugal. She enjoyed all kinds of global products in her own life. She drank tea. I think I mentioned before, you know, the legend is that she brought tea to England. And so she brought Italian opera to England. And so there were all these global products that were part of her dowry that were amazing to English people, and they wanted them too. And so this was part of what moved Charles and his brother James to found the Royal African Company. The the emblem of the Royal African Company is the elephant and castle, and it's an elephant, which is of course represents Africa, and part of what they traded for, it wasn't all enslaved people, but they did trade for ivory and gold as well, that was available in Africa. And then the little castle on top of the elephant is the slave fort. So it's kind of shocking to me often, like how few people know this. Like just when I was in MLA in December, we walked by a restaurant called the Elephant and Castle. There's actually an Elephant and Castle bar in DC. There's an Elephant and Castle tube stop in London, and there's this whole myth that it was that is a mispronunciation of the Infanta de Castile, but in fact it is the actual trademark of the Royal African Company.